Okay, so it's just after 12 noon midday time, so we'll get going. As I say, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to this session, The Value of an Overheard Conversation. I'm Guy Osmond. I'm Managing Director of Osmond Ergonomics, and I've been in the business of workplace design and ergonomics for just over 30 years now. But obviously a lot has changed in the last few, far faster and far more than in the whole of the almost 10 times the amount of time prior to that. So we're hearing a lot today about, well, every day, about hybrid office, working from home, working into the office, what works for people, what doesn't. And I just wanted to pick up on one element of that. I'm not going to talk about the whole hybrid office conversation, but just to discuss one particular element, because I think this is a particularly interesting one. So if we just, yes, get it to move on. Look at the agenda. Not going to be a long session today. Some of you who know me will know I can rabbit on forever, and I'll try not to do that today, but this should be a reasonably concise session. I'm going to start off just by setting the context and talk about hybrid working as we now know it today. The 4 C's, which we were talking about before COVID happened, and how they fit into today's modern working context. And then I'm going to look at some of the elements which impact how we interact with one another, with our colleagues, and so forth within a business environment, whether that is remotely or directly in the office, face-to-face, virtually, and all those other combinations. So I'm going to talk about acoustic comfort, the concept of alone together, something about osmosis learning, and finish up with something I think is really interesting, and it sort of rang a bell when I heard about it, the weak and strong ties connection. So hybrid working, obviously lots of people are doing it now, probably fewer than were originally since when COVID started. It seems to be evolving. Most of the large organizations I'm talking to that we deal with day to day are very much involved with it. I know that a lot of smaller businesses and some very large and very famous ones are saying, nope, we want everybody back in. But we're certainly seeing there's a mix. I read an article this week, might have been end of last week, saying this particular article said about 70% of office workers back in the office at least some of the time, or back in the office. Yes, it's an interesting one. The numbers change almost daily, and just depending which bit of data you want, then you'll get very different answers. But one of my favorite sources of information is the Leesman Index, and Leesman, if you know them, do regular interviews and polls or reviews, surveys of staff across a very large mix of international companies and a very large mix of staff. The last time I checked, I think they had about 1.5 million survey feedbacks on the engagement of staff within various different working environments. So that gives you a pretty big bundle of data to play with. So back before COVID, if you remember that, it seems to have been a different life practically. We used to talk about the 4 C's: communication, collaboration, concentration, and contemplation. And those still apply, but the way they apply seems to have changed quite a lot. And when we first went into lockdown with COVID, everybody was saying they were getting a lot of work done. They were incredibly productive. And I think probably that was because they were doing the 2 on the right, the concentration, actually focused work that they could just get on with without other colleagues around to distract them. People would get on and able to get on and finish projects, get their heads down and get stuff done, but also the opportunity to do some contemplating. And I've deliberately used an image of somebody out going for a walk with mountains in view. Doesn't have to be like that, but actually getting out and thinking. We all know that you get to a point sometimes quite soon, staring at a blank screen or staring at a monitor with data on or something you need to be working on, and the inspiration just stops. You can't focus, your attention goes. And usually the answer to that is get up, stretch, move about. But very often going outside, getting some fresh air, the exhilaration of movement, the air, and also impacting biophilia. I'm not going to touch on biophilia. My colleague Stuart will be talking about that as one of our, he's spoken about it before, but one of our upcoming topics will be biophilia. But just getting out in the natural world is healthy for you and also enables you to think. The number of people I know who say that when we talk about this, say they do some of their best ideas come when they're running or when they're out for a walk with the dog, just when they're actually out away from and allow in a position where they can just let their mind wander whilst also being inspired, hopefully, by the surroundings as well. So there's some talk actually now about whether that achievement in terms of productivity in the early days of COVID necessarily is measured in actually corporate productivity, how much of that concentration and in experience productivity was more personal than across the enterprise. So did the enterprise benefit from that? And the example I give to illustrate that is actually if you spend all day clearing your emails and actually get to the point where maybe you've got half a dozen in your inbox, then you're moving towards inbox zero, then you'll probably feel you've had an incredibly satisfying day. But actually, what have you achieved for the business? Probably not very much, because most of the time you've probably just been doing admin. So that may give a sense of productivity, but whether it's measurable in a commercial enterprise level method is a different story altogether. So what we then, after the conversations in the early days were hearing was that people were missing out on the collaboration, the getting together conversations. On the two C's on the left, communication and collaboration, those were the things that when we first started talking about hybrid working, communication and collaboration were the things that people could get done together in the office. And that's become much more nuanced as people think about it more, because communication, you could, for example, have a room full of people in an office. And I've seen this since we've all been starting to go back in more, or many people have been starting to go back in more, where you can have a room full of people who've all actually got their heads down, just focusing on what they're doing. And then somebody sitting in a phone booth on that same floor plate who look as though they've gone to shut themselves off and get away from everybody else. But in actual fact, they've got a Teams meeting with 20 colleagues. So they're the ones in the telephone box on their own who appear to be who are acoustically sealed from the rest of the room. They look like the ones who shut themselves away from everybody else. But in actual fact, they're the ones doing the collaborating. The people out sitting on the floor in their hot desking may not be interacting with each other at all. So one of the biggest problems, actually, when you have people coming and going in a hybrid environment, is actually finding ways that these situations arise where people can chat and communicate, collaborate. It's easy enough to schedule meetings. People still tend to do it with Teams or Zoom or whatever your medium is. We've got into that habit, and many people seem to be really comfortable with that. So there is the issue of how easy it is to get people to come in. And we know about the cost of transport, the inconvenience. People have got used to the fact they can do everything within the comfort of their own home. We equally know there are people who are desperate to get back into the office because their domestic situation, maybe they're renting with their with some mates, younger people, they may be in a relationship which isn't going very well at the moment. So there's all sorts of other factors. So this whole thing has become very nuanced. So again, that's really why I just want to pick up on one element of that and talk about the conversations. So let's just talk about acoustic comfort next. And one of the things we've noticed with clients since people started to go back into the office is the complaints about noise have gone through the roof compared to what we used to know about previously. Now, some of you will know that a big part of our business is doing workstation assessments of individuals. Usually these are people who've got some sort of musculoskeletal problem, so an upper limb disorder, lower back pain, perhaps a road traffic accident, perhaps a disability. But in the conversations with them, when we have the more holistic chat with them about how's it going, how do they feel, what's bothering them, what's impacting their productivity, historically those conversations were quite often largely about their physical needs, but actually we're finding the conversations are much more about their mental health needs and about their neurological needs in terms of how they think, how they work, and so forth. So we are hearing lots more people saying it's noisy, but we're also finding in some situations, and we have that in our own office, people are actually saying it's too quiet. So because we're quite a small business, when we first came in, there were probably typically a third to about half of the normal number of people we had in the office before COVID. And people said, God, it's deathly quiet, the silence. We don't want to it's almost oppressive, the silence. We don't want to break it. So we've actually put background music into the office to address that. So when there's only a few people in, there is never silence. Some people do it with white noise, but we've just done with some music, and the first one in gets to choose the playlist each day, which so far hasn't caused any major squabbles. So the bigger issue we're finding though is people are saying, grief, it's noisy. I don't know how I ever put up with this. And of course, probably it's no noisier than it was before, but they're just more aware of it, having worked at home in their own environment, whatever that is, perhaps a bedroom. Well, even if it's in their main living room or dining room, it's probably not been more than a handful of people, very often themselves or perhaps children at some stages. But generally, coming back into an office with a reasonable number of people, the noise suddenly jumps up. That also we see impacts different character types. So introverts and extroverts are the obvious ones, which is why I've specifically highlighted it. Extroverts tend to be the ones making the noise very often. Typically, you know, your sort of sales type people perhaps are more noisy. Extrovert types will be busy talking perhaps across the floor rather than in small groups. The introverts who don't want to be part of that big, loud, noisy interaction will be impacted by this and may struggle with it. And the other thing that we're all seeing very much becoming an issue is understanding more about neurodiversity. It follows on from the mental health. I think categorically, as people have been able to, as we've become aware of mental health issues during COVID, we've moved from a state of, it was all quite hush-hush. People didn't want to own up, as they saw it in those days, to having mental health issues because they're worried what the impact would be. Now we've moved on from recognizing what people's needs are, encouraging people to be open about it. And as a result, what we're seeing is that there are channels within most organizations now for people to get help. And once the mental health thing starts to be addressed, there are other elements. I was talking to somebody yesterday about the physical needs of pregnant women. Menopause has become much more of a topic as well, because it's all about mental health. And of course, in amongst all of that is neurodiversity. People are now being able to say, look, I need some help. And as a result of that, we're seeing far more cases of ADHD, but generally speaking, people on the autism scale, people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, all of those things we're seeing cropping up in conversations. So you've got the character types of people interacting, and organizations are needing to actually find a way to, as far as they can, accommodate all of these different things. And there's vision impairment and hearing loss and so forth as well as part of it. So it's become much more complex. But possibly you may well be thinking, well, what the hell's that got to do with conversations? Well, obviously there's lots of conversations going on in those scenarios I'm talking about, but also there are people coming in for different reasons. So this whole recognition of diversity and being more inclusive and accommodating different needs, there are situations which we need to be aware of that we can recognize. And this is one I only came across quite recently, the concept of alone together. And I actually had a note because I've forgotten her name. I'll actually just tell you where I heard it from. It was a lady, I was at Workplace Trends Research Summit earlier the year, and it was Harriet Short was doing research at University of Western England. And so this concept of people coming in to be alone together. So we talked a few moments ago, and many people talk regularly about people coming in to collaborate, people coming in to communicate. But as I was also just mentioned, some people come into the office and they're not really looking to communicate at all. They're just there to do their work. But they choose to come in because they want to be somewhere where there are other people around. Now, don't think I've encountered anybody who said, I just loved homeschooling during lockdown. There may be one or two, but I've certainly not met them. Friends of mine have said things like, actually, if we got through the day and nobody had been killed, that was a pretty successful day's homeschooling. But there are people now who would actually were coming into school holidays again, but have been with nobody else in the house. They're on their own. There's obviously an element perhaps of fear of missing out. But this idea of alone together, and I don't know, I can see the chat. I don't know if anybody recognizes the Elephant House. Does anybody know why the Elephant House? It's closed, unfortunately, but know why it's famous. I'm just going to put up my chat box in case anybody puts anything in. I'll only wait a moment, but there may be something that... So the Elephant House is in Edinburgh, or it was before it closed. Unfortunately, I think COVID took its toll on yet another hospitality thing. But now I'm not seeing anything coming up. Probably people thinking, oh, I'm not quite getting to typing yet. But it's the Elephant House is where J.K. Rowling actually first started writing Harry Potter. And I think she wrote the whole of the first book there. Now, I've never met her, never had a chance to inquire, but we know she was a single mum with not much money. She may have been there to keep warm. She may have been there because it was the only place she had a flat surface and Wi-Fi. I've no idea. But one of the reasons it might be is actually she just wanted to be in the company of others. So this is a situation where, and you'll have seen it, if you go into Starbucks, Costa, Cafe Nero, whoever your preferred coffee house is, and you'll watch people, and some are in deep conversations, some seem to be watching TV, but there are a lot of people not in groups of people socializing directly and in person, but actually conducting work, making phone calls. Sometimes those, particularly if they're people on a phone call and they're extroverts, they're actually distracting everybody else. But on a few occasions, I'd like to try and find a corner table and just observe people working and how they're working and or interacting. And so some people are actually there just because they don't want to be alone. And if you think about that concept of children playing, one of my favorite ideas is the idea of children playing with Lego. And if you put small children playing with Lego, quite often they will play together in as much as they're in the same space, probably sitting on the floor together, but they'll make their own separate things. It's not common for small children to collaborate to make some complete thing. So that idea of being in company of others, but actually not doing anything with them, but just being there, I think is quite a significant thing. Now, what happens when you're in that situation, if you come in just to be amongst people, is you will overhear stuff. You just pick up on it. We all know the psychology that if you're in a crowded room and you hear your name from across the room, you will immediately pick up on that. You may hear words you recognize. I was in a pub with my wife in the Lake District, the middle of last year, and we actually overheard somebody mention the village just down the road from us. I mean, that was just coincidence. They were probably 10 feet away. We were in conversation, but just that one village name just popped out. No clue what the rest of the conversation was, but we just had a little chat, my wife and I, about how weird it was that we'd hear somebody who perhaps had been there recently or whatever. I have no idea. You do pick this stuff up. And that can be, of course, in that case, it wasn't, but can be, of course, a trigger for a conversation. And so that may lead on to something else or be interesting or useful or however it might be. So certainly, if you've been to conferences and you join in a conversation, or you might choose in the coffee break to actually wander around, who shall I join? And then you hear somebody mention something that you can immediately relate to, that gives you an opportunity to join into the conversation. So that overhearing stuff to pick up on comes from a lot of different sources. And this is just an example of the sort of thing that happens and where people go. Bear with me a minute because it's not moving on, so I need to click again. Okay. We've probably heard of this, but one of the things that we've heard that people are missing out on through not being in the office is those serendipitous moments of conversations. You've heard of the concept, I'm sure, of osmosis learning, which is just picking stuff up as you go along. And the one thing that people have widely noted, particularly for young staff coming into the workplace for the first time, we all take for granted just how much we pick up along the way. And so just conversations you overhear, people who are talking about something you're interested in, or somebody who approaches you by the coffee machine, in the lift, in the car park, all of those opportunities where you just get into a chat with somebody. So that may prove to be something that in the course of a conversation, you may find that you have something in common. You may never have met, you may work in the same organization, but not know each other, or you may know each other vaguely because you've seen each other. But all those scenarios create ways and opportunities for conversations. It's one of the reasons that many employers now have what I call Wagamama tables. I'm sure there's a technical thing, but if you know Wagamama, they have the great big bench tables where you just find a place to seat long tables with benches either side, and you find a space. And quite often, and that's the idea of it, the very social idea of eating, the Japanese concept, that you might well get into a conversation, particularly if you're just one or two of you, with the people either side of you, and that starts conversations up. So employers have actually noticed the importance and the value of that. So you'll find many canteen operations or staff breakout areas where the people are going to be eating are actually designed with long tables that people can just grab a seat at, rather than historically what were largely circular tables. So that's another opportunity to get into a conversation with people. And then we had a client quite recently who actually discovered that there was one particular place in, sorry, I say quite recently, it's before COVID now. So yes, I've said it already, but everything before COVID seems to be, it seems to be a lump of our life that's just gone, and everything before seems to have been another world. But so this was a situation where different departments were passing one another in a particular intersection of corridors. I think one direction was going to the canteen and one direction was going to the toilets or something like that. And people would bump into each other. And then the business recognized that. So they actually put some breakout seating available. They were able to make a space available at that intersection. So people who bumped into each other, rather than just passing like ships in the night, they would have the opportunity actually to stop and continue the conversation. Maybe if they'd just come from the canteen with a coffee, they could sit down with it. And I'm sure, I don't know any update on this, but quite possibly people are now using that as a meeting intersection area. So this idea of what you pick up from what you overhear, we've certainly noticed it in our own business when we started out, and I unfortunately had to put a very high proportion of the business on furlough, as many businesses did. We were able to start bringing them back reasonably quickly, but we had literally, the management team were running the whole business at the early stages of COVID. And therefore the communication lines were very short, and we spent a big chunk of our time saying, why do we do it this way? So it gave us an opportunity as we talked amongst ourselves about things we otherwise wouldn't normally have talked about, because we had processes in place that were working. Turned out, like so many processes, they'd evolved, i.e. grown, and they got a bit clunky and inefficient. So we were able to do quite a lot of tying stuff up. And we're still seeing now the productivity through improved systems since COVID. There's no doubt that's the case. But the other thing we also found is once we started to get people back to work, but still working at home. So we're in a position where everybody already had a laptop. So we were able to get those who needed to work at home onto laptops very quickly. And as we brought people off furlough, we were able to get them set up, even if they hadn't previously done any home working. So we're able to get all of that into position. And soon after that, we found ourselves, the management team was saying, we screwed up on something. It might be quite trivial, but it's something that we noticed, and we kept saying, God, that would never have happened before. And we realized that actually perhaps our processes weren't as watertight as we thought, but what actually happened was, if everybody was in the office together, somebody would overhear a conversation, or somebody would pick up on something that was being said between two colleagues, or somebody would hear somebody on the phone. So we found that these interactions, people were finding that they were just picking stuff up historically, and then we realized when we didn't have everybody in that we were missing out on quite a lot of information. Errors were being made just because the stuff that we used to take for granted simply wasn't happening. So that osmosis learning covers quite a wide range of just basically overhearing conversations. Now, this is my favorite one, actually, because I think this is really interesting. And it was a bit of a light bulb moment for when I heard it. So the concept of this, and again, I've got to note, I don't have a name, but it was a study in University of Pennsylvania about strong and weak ties. So strong ties are defined as your primary contacts, and weak ties are any beyond that. So you can see the first row of 3 people as primary contact, And then the next row is secondary, and obviously there'll be tertiary, and whatever your role within the business, it will be much more complex. And this is just a simple diagram to illustrate the point. But the study that they made at University of Pennsylvania said that the real creativity came from interaction with secondary contacts, because the people you deal with day to day, it's exactly that. You're dealing with them day to day, you're in conversation, you think all along the same lines. You may come at it from a different way, but each of you thinks about the topics you've discussed. You're working in a way that you've agreed, following whatever procedures have been created. So those are the people that actually, they're a bit like your echo chamber. We've heard of how social media gets people into an echo chamber where they just keep hearing the same views from everybody they know and everybody who joins into them and everybody who picks up on stuff that's been tagged and stuff that's been liked. And the whole mechanism of social media tools is actually to share amongst people, to create a people who actually get the same information fed to them. And so that's pretty much what's happening with your primary contacts. Now, no matter how innovative you are or think you are, the day-to-day interactions with your primary contacts will be along very similar lines. Now, your secondary contacts and the ones beyond that, your weaker ties, they're the people you don't know so well, you don't interact with them on a regular basis. They may be very different character types, they may actually have very different job roles. They're the interactions, talking to them, where you actually get the creativity most commonly. That's the people who think differently, approach it differently. I'm misquoted, I know, but there's a saying, I think attributed to Einstein, but probably not, something along the lines of, you won't solve a problem by coming at it from the same direction you did in the first place. And that's an awful misquote. I completely mangled it, but you probably heard the expression. But it's the same idea that actually, if there's a problem, don't get the same group of people back in together to solve it who were the ones who created it. There's a lot to be learned in politics from that, but we won't go on to that. But very often organizations say, well, here's the management team, here's the problem. It's the same management team that got us into this problem. And so now we're asking them to get us out of it. So that creativity, those ideas, the inspirations, the light bulb moment, they come from people you don't interact with quite so frequently. So those overheard conversations are particularly significant. And the importance of this in the context of how we work now with hybrid working is actually, if you're doing lots of virtual meetings, and I know that now we've got into the habit of Teams and Zoom, it's quick, it's easy, everybody understands the technology. I don't get why Zoom just never properly works straight after I've done Teams and vice versa. I'm sure there's some conspiracy, and now I'm doing Google Meets with some people as well. And I always seem to be need tweaked settings, but sorry, that's a rant for another day. We'll get back to it. But if you're used to virtual meetings, we're doing a lot of virtual meetings, and we're missing out on these secondary contacts. We're only tending to have meetings for obvious reasons with the people we think are directly involved with it. And also we are missing out on the sort of social interaction, because we tend very often to just get, we have an agenda, or we should have an agenda for a virtual meeting. We get in, we get stuck in, we talk about the topic. That's it. Thank you very much. Job done and away. So when we were all in lockdown still, and I still have people on furlough or largely in lockdown, I started having monthly staff meetings, which I still do every other month, which I call the big picture, where we shut the business for 2 hours. And actually, I try to get everybody in for that, for all these sorts of reasons. And when I was doing that and it was virtual, we would have 10-minute drop-ins before and after the main meeting. So actually, we would randomly drop people into small groups of 2, 3, 4 people to just chat about anything, football, animals, pets, interests, whatever it happens to be, just so that they would interact with one another and get to know people they didn't normally work with. But that doesn't tend to happen. You tend to find in businesses, all of these meetings, specifics, particularly so many meetings these days have just back to back. I never understand how people can come out of a meeting and go straight into another one. I just wonder how, if you don't have anything if there's nothing to do as a result of the meeting, why have the meeting? And if there is stuff to do, when the hell are you going to do it when you've got to go straight into another meeting? But again, yet another rant. Let's keep it back on topic. So my idea here is those overheard conversations, particularly with a secondary contact. I'm not saying you go around just earwigging everything. I'm just saying in the normal day-to-day interaction that one has in the workplace, those opportunities arise and continue to exist and should be cherished. So I'm not suggesting here we should just abandon home working altogether, but I'm just making the point that this is one element of the big conversation that needs to be taken very seriously, because there is a risk that you will lose out on creativity, on inspiration, on the productive interactions when you're just going about business as usual with the people you deal with all day. So that's the topic for today. As I said, it's quite a brief one. I've just slightly run over the 30 minutes. If you want to contact me, my email is here. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, you can scan the QR code now with your phone and it'll take you straight to it.